Good evening, Battle Creek, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Our View, the show that really tries to take into account families in poverty and vulnerable populations in Battle Creek and bring their voice to the table. Joining me today is my lovely co-host, Mia Henry. We have Daniel Jones, Executive Director from the Haven of Rest Ministries, and Dr. Smith from Kingdom Builders. And our topic today is a kind of hot topic in the community, especially among our community, but it's the aftermath of what we fondly call the 209. I'm sure it's referred to as the Battle Creek Homeless Shelter is the proper name. Our population calls it the 209. If anybody wonders why, it's because the address is 209 Michigan Ave. So I guess we want to start with asking the question, why this shelter? We've heard so many different things, like we've heard that it was because of COVID, and then it was spacing issues at the Haven, but why was this shelter put there in the first place?
I think it was a response to COVID initially, and that's kind of what we've read in the newspapers. The Haven had a drop-in shelter, overnight shelter. We called it the warm shelter. And as COVID started, we realized that having up to 30 people overnight in a space of about 560 square feet did not comply at all with, what do they call that, social distancing at the time.
Oh.
So maybe you'd have a mat on the floor and you'd be literally adjacent to the person next to you. That's not safe, either for the residents or the guests overnight or for the staff, for that matter. So when COVID began, the Haven discontinued that particular overnight warm shelter. All our other shelters, our men's shelter, the Inasmuch House for women and children, stayed open and people could check in. It was not a business as usual situation. If you remember back in March of 2020, we just couldn't have that overnight packed in together like that in 560 square feet with 30 people. So that shelter was shut down. And I think our community and various people in our community thought that that was a desperately needed aspect of overnight shelter, although our men's shelter never shut down and continued operating. So they opened the 209 Battle Creek Shelter. At the time,
it started initially with tents outside of
it was
Share
initially
Center.
at Full Blast.
Not at Share Center.
It was a full blast.
At Full Blast.
Yep. And it moved to Full
And
Blast.
so the tents helped with the social distancing.
Well, they were at Full Blast in a gymnasium, so they could space out quite a bit more with social distancing.
Okay.
Ultimately,
Such was not the case with the new shelter, though. I mean, that was tight conditions too, right? Once it opened.
And then they had some heat issues, electrical issues with the facility at Full Blast.
Okay.
Let me jump in by just saying, I think every organization that is addressing that population is needed, and they're all good at what they do, especially Haven. What happened was, from a perspective, the former CEO of the Kellogg Foundation, Community Foundation, Brenda Hunt, she thought a need to just go a little further, taking advantage of a space that was available at 209, which is just the front part. That's just the office building. I think years ago it used to be dentist building, but there's a facility in the back.
The warehouse part.
The warehouse, yeah. Big basketball, former coach. Man did it for his child, I believe. So they decided to just make that transition during the COVID. Was it a temporary thing? I'm not sure. Was it permanent? I'm not sure. It was just going to be a low barrier.
And Daniel, Haven was a partner in that at that time too, right? Like you were providing some staffing.
we contracted,
They did.
to provide overnight staffing. Our staff has been trained and doing it for years and years. So yeah, we were providing the staff on third shift.
So in the beginning, is it fair to say this was kind of a collaborative where the Haven and Share Center, Kingdom Builders was not involved at that point, correct?
I was involved with the food,
Oh, that's
from
right.
day
Okay,
one.
okay.
but they were always involved. I mean, it was a collaboration. Everybody, they helped provide the proper staff, it's part of the food. It was a collaboration.
Did
Yeah.
you continue to staff it the whole time it was open?
Up until December of 2023, yeah.
Okay.
Overnight, third shift, and then we brought breakfast from the Havens Kitchens over.
Nice. So in 2023, that's when they got their own 501c3, went out on their own.
They had begun that 501c3 a long time before that.
Long
I think
time.
January of 2024 was when the Community Foundation stepped out, and that's who we were contracted with.
Okay.
And so when they transferred to Kingdom Builders in January of 2024,
You got your own staff.
yeah, he had
Yes.
a team. Dr. Smith had his own staff there.
Okay.
How long were you in Full Blast before you actually got the warehouse in 209?
They were down in full blast for maybe 4 or 5 months,
Yes.
and then they moved to Share Center
Okay.
in the parking lot in a tent.
Okay, that's where the Share Center tents come from. Okay, so
Yeah.
if I started at Full Blast Share Center and then eventually went to the
Yeah.
warehouse.
I think by October or November of that year, when it started to get cold, the tent was no longer an option, and that's when it moved to 209.
So really, it was an answer to housing this population that couldn't be housed anymore through the warm shelter.
It was housing the population that was no longer able to take advantage of
Of the
the
warm
warm shelter, as we called it. Yeah.
Okay. So now I'm going to ask another question, and I want to say that fully that I don't really understand this. I researched a little bit of it online across the United States, but the big thing about the 209 was this cliche that it was a low barrier, no barrier shelter. What I saw online was that across the United States, they do have some of these low barrier shelters, but it seemed like what they were trying to avoid was if you didn't have your birth certificate or an ID, most shelters wouldn't let you stay because you couldn't prove who you were. That is not an issue at the Haven. You do not have to
That is
have an
not,
ID.
and we qualify as a low barrier shelter as well.
Okay.
We're funded through the Salvation Army, which is a national, through the state of Michigan, and they don't fund you unless you are low barrier.
So then this myth that the community had that the Haven wasn't low barrier, so we needed a low barrier, that's not exactly true.
I don't think it's accurate.
Okay.
I think it's definitely a communication issue
Okay.
from all of us.
I've got that.
But the reality is, you got a population of people that need a place to go at 1 o'clock at night or 10 p.m. And so the question becomes, is there a place in Battle Creek for them to go at 10 p.m. drunk?
Should there be though?
Yeah, that's part
No,
of
we're just asking. We're just asking. We're dealing with the realistic reality here. It's not about should there be or are we entitling people in this community. That's what you have. You have people at 1 o'clock walking the street, and so what we were trying to do was there became a complaint from a lot of people of folks just walking around.
I can see
Again,
that.
from my perspective, Haven, Share Center, amazing. What I don't want is I don't want society to think there's a war between 3 organizations. That's like having a bunch of churches. Everybody has their own needs. Everybody got their different
absolutely.
philosophies.
And everyone's needed. I
Yeah,
agree
so
with
we
that.
were all dealing with that population, but even today, at 10 o'clock, you got folks with a luggage at the Sojourner Truth with a little group of us together doing everything. That's a reality. And so we were
guess it
just
is a
trying to
reality.
pick them up.
I guess that is a reality, but man, I hope I don't get in trouble for my church. But I'm a member of Trinity Lutheran Church where Women's Co-op is housed, and we know that's a reality too. But at one point, we had a person sleeping in our bushes. You can't sleep in our bushes. We didn't just say, get out of our bushes, can't sleep in our bushes. We, of course, asked all the right questions of how can we help. But at the end of the day, you can't sleep in our bushes. I just sometimes, help me here, Mia, feel like having a low barrier, very low barrier, where you can come in drunk or intoxicated or high is
Maybe we should explain that for lay people who don't know that there are rules when it comes to sheltering. Are there rules? Does the Haven have some
Well-
restrictions or some?
Not really. I mean, if
Boundaries
someone
or-
came in drunk, intoxicated, high, and that happens all the time, there's no barrier to them being served with
Okay.
shelter. We'll welcome them in best we can to check them in whatever state they're in. We ask them to lay down, sleep it off, or
Makes sense.
at least not disrupt the operations of the shelter. A lot
same
of
at
times,
the Battle Creek shelter.
Meaning what? Don't disrupt.
Yeah, like you
people?
can come in at any
Oh, yeah,
time.
we have policies where if they did disrupt, we would have to call the police, unfortunately.
Right.
Right.
Sure.
When they start, and inevitably, somebody that's drunk or high, if they don't just want to lay down and sleep it off, they want to start issues. They want to create whatever inside the shelter and then disrupt the operations. Much like Battle Creek Shelter, we have to ask them to leave at that point.
Yeah.
And yeah, if choices are being made, if you're wandering around at 1 o'clock in the morning drunk and high, you're going to come into the shelter and sleep it off, that's great. We'll work with you in the morning and try and get some progress made. More often than not, that's just not an option for somebody to peacefully and quietly go to sleep. They're ready to tear it up.
Now, we're averaging about 70 people per night. So where are they coming from? That's every night.
Well, they're coming from Battle Creek, right?
I'm just saying. And these are the same people that probably go through the system.
Is it the same 70 people?
No, I'm saying these are the same people that's probably going through other organizations in the daytime,
Sure.
being treated, eating, but for whatever reason, when it's time for night, they're there.
Well, and I mean, in all fairness, with the housing market the way that it is and rents the way it is, it's not hard to believe that shelters in our community would be very overwhelmed with folks who can't find a place to stay.
I'm gonna
So does the low
let me say
barrier-
this so I may get in trouble with this, but people know I'm very transparent. I don't believe everybody want a house.
I believe that. I believe that too.
So because that's not, some people, it's fine, as Dan would tell you, some get a check every month, some serve this country, some just want to be off the grid
I can
and
see
live
that.
their own life. And they're good with that.
Which we had a conversation pre-show, and
Yeah.
I'm going to get in trouble now, but opinion-wise for me, y'all can have your own opinion. I think that's fine. If you want to live, we had a guy who we placed at one of our facilities. I won't name the facility. Placed him at a facility. And he was like, good. And he was sleeping next door to the facility. And this guy was great. Like, he showed up for every shift, did everything that was expected of him, gave no trouble at work. But when it came to us saying, hey, buddy, you can't sleep next to the facility, let's see what we can do to get you into a boarding house or, some other situation, he didn't want that. So much so did he not
quit the
want
job.
that. He quit the job.
He got tired of with the job. He didn't.
So I do understand that. But there's another part of me that's like, okay, if you're fine being out there doing your own thing and you don't want a house or a trailer, who am I to judge? But I'm also not going to fit the bill for you to do that indefinitely.
So what we do, times 10, times 50. You got 50 of those guys you just perfectly
Described?
described. What we're going to do with them? Because they're living in your city and they're not leaving. So what we do with them at 10 o'clock?
I don't want him to leave. First of all, I want to make that really
So
clear.
what we do?
I am a big person who advocates for, even when we talked in this community about prostitution, yes, may not appeal to everybody. It doesn't appeal to me.
Right.
I don't need their services, but I also understand that they are residents of Battle Creek, Michigan, and they have every right to be here, just like those 70 people at that shelter. They have every right to be in this community. It's their community too. I'm just saying, if you don't want to go out and work or be a productive member of society and have a place that you call home, then why should somebody else foot the bill for you to have that?
So what
if
do we-
you're good. If
so
you're
what do
good,
we
I
do
don't need to
with
foot
them?
the bill for you.
They can't go to Dan. They won't follow his rules. They won't follow the person rules. They won't follow your rules. So what do we do? That's the question.
Well, when they don't follow the rules at co-op, we say, look, you're not really where we need you to be today. Doesn't mean you can't come back, but for today, you're going to have to leave.
Okay.
And then come back with a different attitude, because from where you're coming from, we can't help. And I believe this is the same situation. I'm not against shelters, Daniel, you know that. I'm a strong supporter of the Haven. I didn't get acquainted soon enough to be a
Right,
strong
right.
supporter of Battle Creek Shelter. This show is whether or not we should have had both or how it all works, but I think that a shelter needs to address where people are, but then they need to help them get to a better place where they can be productive members of society and take care of themselves.
So my goal was always to try to get them to go back to him or his organization. That was always we were.
Like clean 'em up,
We were
get
trying to be
'em
a
right,
feeder.
mind
We
the
were trying to be a
rules.
feeding program, but they have to mentally be prepared.
Yeah.
I absolutely believe that.
So again, we go back to that's what we call the low barrier. Same low barrier concept, but we're referring to the low barrier where
It's mental health
it's
issues.
those people that you said don't want to go anywhere and don't want to listen to anybody. And unfortunately, we have a great percentage of people like that in the world, not just Battle Creek.
I believe that.
Kalamazoo is flooded on Rose Street.
I just think that we all take some different sides in this. 'Cause,
Yeah.
I mean, I talk to friends and colleagues about this all the time. It's the work, right? I'm sure you guys do too. And you get these opinions like some people think that, oh my gosh, no one can afford the rent, so they have to stay in these shelters. And it's like, no.
These aren't one-dimensional issues. They're
Right.
not. And the more
And
you
they're
talk
not.
about them, the more you find out. Like, I never really thought about that aspect of, true, people don't want to have a place. Some people are okay with getting up every morning, taking their few belongings, and that's a simple life. Maybe
Simple
the way
life.
they think God intended it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
these issues are way more than one-dimensional, and there's really
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is untreated mental health challenges on the street.
Absolutely.
And that's a gap in our system
Yeah.
where nobody, perhaps this person likes, sleeping next to the building where they work. You and I might make a different choice, or you and I might look at that and say, well, that's a mental health challenge that's untreated. As long as that person hasn't committed any violence against
you.
anybody,
Right.
law enforcement won't really intervene.
Exactly.
There's no reason to. They can't be arrested. They're not doing anything improper. They can be asked to leave somebody's property if they, like women's co-op says, you can't sleep in our bushes. Okay, that's trespassing. They're not going to be arrested for that. Unless there's real violence happening, this untreated mental health challenge that somebody may be experiencing is just going to continue.
Well, and again, too, what we've experienced at co-op is that you can't and you shouldn't force a person to deal with mental health issues if they don't want to.
No.
Like, like you said, Dr. Smith, if they say they're good, I mean,
Yeah, meet 'em
we
where they're at.
can't.
Absolutely.
I mean, I firmly believe that.
I do too.
And so we were in great partnership with the police department. When some were released at night, where do you think they sent them to?
The shelter.
Absolutely.
Go over there and go to sleep.
Absolutely. So those are
so
the
does
reasons
it
why
work?
it's needed.
Does it work? Does avoiding these barriers work? Does it help people?
I think there's no funds to support what we're trying to describe because of probably the reason of what you're saying. Do we fund an entitlement population
So,
of people?
so funding is looking for an outcome,
Yes.
right? So if someone's going to fund you, like the Kellogg Foundation, whoever, I don't want to name anything, but if you're going to be grant funded, the grant is probably looking for a positive outcome. Is that kind of what?
We get measured on a couple different outputs. One is positive exits to housing.
Okay.
And, state averages for how many people come through their shelter system statewide, just like the Haven is one of those shelters, and how many exit to positive housing environments, safe permanent housing with their name on the lease or, somewhere like that.
And
we
so
get measured on that.
women and children don't necessarily didn't stay at the Battle Creek shelter,
Correct. Women, yes.
but not women with children.
Correct.
Right. We continued to operate because the space was adequate, the overnight warm shelter for women and children.
Okay.
So yeah, we saw a continuation of that.
So here we are today. We know that there's still not enough space all the time for the families. We experience that because co-op calls the Haven and says we have women and children, or we have a gentleman. What do we do to answer that question? Like, where are we now that this Battle Creek shelter has closed? What does the future hold?
Kind of two different areas you're asking about. Women with children were not able to go to Battle Creek Shelter, so they've always
Right.
come to the Inasmuch House. We've always opened our warm shelter overnight. If they are aware of it and come to us, they're welcome into the warm shelter. And we've seen the population tick up a little bit since the closure of Battle Creek Shelter. The other part, the question, do we need both shelters? When we have capacity like we have at the Haven, and in the men's shelter, we've got 50 beds. 20 to 25 are open right now. We've got capacity. It is a question of Dr. Smith mentioned, do they want to deal with our rules And I think there's a perception that we have a bunch of rules and that everybody has to, and I think that's unfortunate, and I think that's not accurate. We ask people not to disrupt the shelter, and if they want to come in drunk, high, whatever, that's not a showstopper. But if they're going to disrupt the shelter, yeah, we can't have that. That's chaos. That'll descend
course.
quickly.
Tina, where do you see?
My response is what you're doing right now. See, what you're doing is you are informing the audience. Everybody may not know what I did or what we did. Everybody may not know what the Haven. So even today, I'm hearing something I didn't know. So that's a good thing. But the second thing is we provide transportation for children that's in the foster system. So let's just say Ms. Mia is a foster parent and she's on vacation. I got this child. I need an emergency spot. Or let's say she's available, but right now her home is not ready to take this disruption. This young man needs to go somewhere. I still feel that shelter was like that emergency shelter. That's why I don't think it should have ever been in competition with the Haven.
Or that it should have been a long-term thing.
It should have never been in competition. Right. Temporary. That's what these emergency kids, we put kids in temporary places until they're in placement. I see that shelter being a temporary thing.
You
Now,
agree with
now
that,
when
Tina?
you say rules, sir, so there's not an education that they have to go through to be in your place. See, I didn't know this. I thought it was an education, so I have to learn more about what they offer.
You're speaking like a religious education or something like that? Or?
No, like if Floyd knocked on your door at 9 and he's drunk, you're saying he can just come in and go to sleep. I don't think a lot of folks know that.
I did not know that.
I don't think a lot of folks
I've
know
heard
that.
people express to me
Yeah,
that
see?
certain things that, like I
That's
had
good
no
to know.
idea.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
That's
I knew
great
that.
to know.
And, the folks who show up without ID, that's not a showstopper either. Some low barrier rules apply to the LGBT or trans community, and people show up and identify as whichever gender, we will place them in that shelter, whichever gender they identify as. And we've done that for years. All my staff is trained in adequately serving every population.
That's good.
It's good.
Difficult question. I don't know if either of you can answer. And in all fairness to our audience, I did reach out to Battle Creek Community Foundation. They didn't feel that they had someone who could fairly comment or be on the show because they had turned this over to a board, months ago. They did put me in touch with Todd McDonald, who was the president of the Battle Creek Shelter Board. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to be here today, and I wasn't able to catch up with him for comment on some of these things. So if you can't answer, I understand. But what was the cost of doing business for the shelter? Because we have a rough idea, just from in the community, but do either of you know the monthly cost of running the shelter?
We're looking at about a $600,000 annual, 700. We're talking about roughly 50,000 a month, 60,000. It's very expensive.
That's kind of what we thought, that it was a very expensive ticket item. And then I guess my next question is really for Daniel. If the Haven, who's been in existence for 125 years doing this business,
68 years anyway.
okay,
You think of Charitable Union, they've been around 125
trying to
years.
confuse that. Yeah.
We're about half that, so 68 years.
Close to 100 years.
Yep.
What would this funding that's being funneled to this other emergency shelter, what would that mean to the addition that you want to build for the Haven? And would that addition
Yeah.
cover what Dr. Smith is talking about, an emergency situation for folks?
We've got a capital campaign planned and a building that we want to make that's multi-purpose space. During the daytime, it can be dining facility and a new code-compliant kitchen. At night, it could be a drop-in. It could be an overnight shelter for the exact population that we're talking about here.
Can it house the numbers that Dr. Smith is talking about, the 70 people?
As we were serving overnight shelter up until the end of 2023, we never saw many more than 35 or 40 people over there overnight. So if the uptick in population happened late in 24, I'm not sure if we could serve all 70, but again, even right now, I'm thinking we saw 7 or 8 come across after the shelter closed at the end of May and check in, and maybe 4 or 5 in the women's shelter. So
Okay.
the others, back to your original question, what could we have done with that funding? The numbers we've heard, anywhere up to $5 million over the last 4 years. And that's tragic in our community. If I'd have ever been given a phone call to say, hey, can you do something? I could have done it, I think, for $2.5 million, save you $2.5 million. And I don't know what the numbers are, but
It does seem like a lot of money. What do you think, Dr. Smith?
I think a lot had to do with the way they rebuild, reconstruct, redevelop that building. They put all
Well, and I
this
think a
brand
lot of
new
it,
facility stuff in
to
there.
fairness to the foundation too, they're not in the business of direct service, right? They're in the business
they
of
were.
funding direct services. So everything was outsourced. Like the Haven did the staffing, Kingdom Builders did the food. I think there was another company that was offering security. Or were you doing the security,
Mr. Hampton.
Mr. Hamilton? So outsourcing all that stuff probably is what made it such a high ticket thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Even now, I mean, if the Haven is absorbing some of the population from that, we're getting none of the funding that was coming from anywhere.
Well, there is no more funding.
No, but
that's
there was
correct?
no funding. Yeah, that's correct.
So, when we talk about women and children, that shelter needs to grow.
Inasmuch House could grow. When we originally constructed it, we built it so that it could have a second story. You just have to kind of take the existing roof off and build up. Anything construction-wise nowadays is extremely expensive. It's probably doubled since COVID times, the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Smith, what's your intentions for, do you want to open the shelter back up?
So I was already, we are a 501c3. We have the / community side, church side, so we can't always be on the radar. But we were already addressing that small population. So
Okay.
we house 6 or 7 people.
Okay.
We've been doing that. That's nothing new.
At Kingdom Builders.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So that's nothing new.
That's kind of fabulous.
So because truthfully, people homeless situation is not everybody's business. Now, if I'm getting into the business of asking for funds, now I got to do all of that. We were not trying to do all of that.
Okay.
Now there's some funds available. I'm not into competition with organizations like Haven. I mean, I don't do what they do, but I am still concerned about that group that I see every night. Whether they knocked on the door or didn't knock on the door, they're not going anywhere. And I'm concerned about the community. This is going to sound real bad from a corporate perspective, but we got folks coming in town, deciding where to live. I don't want the first thing they see when they say, welcome Battle Creek, Sojourner Truth, a bunch of beds and people laying there sleeping. So if I can help clean that up, one at a time, then that's what we're going to do. So yes, we are in the process. We've got 60 acres of land, but everything is still regulated by the city and the state. So I can only do what I'm allowed to do. And that's a struggle for me.
That's a struggle for me every day too, friend, and me and probably
Just because you
Daniel
want
as
to
well.
do good doesn't
Doesn't
mean
mean you
people
get
can
to.
let you do good.
Doesn't mean people are going to fund it, right? Well, we need to wrap up, but I appreciate you gentlemen joining us today. I'm sure we could talk about this subject a whole lot longer. I don't even think we got through all of our questions. I do want to just plug a couple things here as we close. One is Daniel and I are on a committee, which I talked to Dr. Smith today about joining us in some of this work, but tiny homes at Trinity where people could transition from shelter to tiny home to work on home ownership or the transition into adequate housing. So I wanted to plug that. And then I also, Robert from Share Center, Robert Eckerd, I asked him to join us today, but he was traveling and not able to. And we just reached out to him for comment just to ask him, since the shelter had closed, had he seen an uptick in people that were using the Share Center? And he said the reality of it is not really, because the people who were at the shelter were already using the Share Center during the day. So he didn't really see an uptick, and he didn't really have a lot of comments on any of the rest of it either. And I also wanted to clear up a couple other things because I was very disturbed when I heard on the news that there were buses that had come from Muskegon and Coldwater to pack up our residents that we no longer wanted and ship them off to these cities. I want to make it very clear to anybody in our audience that that did not happen, correct?
Correct, that did not happen.
Yeah, I don't know how that got misbrained in the news, but I know that there was nobody that got bussed out of our community. We're not saying we don't want folk here, please go somewhere else. That was
a ploy by something else.
very disturbing, though, was it not, friends?
But
I mean, because
that was not the case. That was not the case.
And I think that everybody sitting here right now agrees that residents, whether they're homeless or want to be homeless or struggling wherever they are, all residents are welcome here.
But when we
in
shut
Battle
down,
Creek.
Dan came up front, so I'll do whatever I can to help.
Yeah.
There was no division. The day we shut down, his organization and Sheriff Center,
Yes.
they all both agreed. We'll do whatever we can. It wasn't all that stuff about Muskegon. I don't know who created that story.
So at the end of the day, that's where we all still are, right? We're going to
Yes.
do whatever we can
Yes.
as very powerful leaders of this community, right?
Servants of the community.
Servants. Servants. I like that better. You're always there to humble me, Daniel.
Try to.
We need this. Thanks, Battle Creek, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.